Hello, this is the Wixom Institute, and today we'll be talking about the first unit of Dr. Marr's AP Psychology. And the first unit dealt with the history of psychology. But first, let's talk about the definition of psychology. And the definition of psychology is the study of the mind. Relatively simple. So one important person you'll need to know for the history of psychology is Wilhelm Wundt. Wilhelm Wundt was the father of psychology. You see the man in the middle? That's him. He and his student Titchener created a school of thought known as structuralism. What structuralism did was use a new concept known as introspection. And to introspect is to look within yourself, which wasn't exactly scientific. Later on, or right after that, an American scholar known as William James created a school of thought known as functionalism. And this is really similar to the Darwinian ideas of why humans do certain things. It dealt with the evolutionary concepts about adapting, surviving, and flourishing. And so later on in the history of psychology, in the early 20th century, there was behaviorism. And behaviorism had two major parts in it. First, that psychology is an objective science. And second, that psychologists would study behavior without referring to mental processes. What it means by this is that it would study the reactions of a subject, but not take into things like mental health and such. Many psychologists today agree with the first statement of psychology being objective science, but not the second statement of not referring to mental processes. A famous behaviorist is B.F. Skinner, and B.F. Skinner created something known as the Skinner box. We'll talk about that later, but it's used in marketing today, and it has impacted your life in one form or another. There is another school of thought known as Freudian psychology. What Freudian psychology dealt with is how our past affects our decisions. It dealt with how our childhood memories that are in our subconscious and unconscious mind, and how they would affect what we do day to day. And as you know, the father of Freudian psychology is Sigmund Freud. And it is now known today as psychodynamic theory. On to the second module, which talked more about the controversies and different viewpoints in psychology. So, there is a known controversy known as the nature versus nurture issue. Alright? So, the nature side would deal with genetics, while nurture will deal with environment. For example, if you take an intelligent person, alright, and a person that agrees with the nature part of the issue would say, the parents gave the intelligent person good genes, and that's what makes them intelligent. And the nurture issue, or someone that agrees with the nurture side, would say, no, it's its parents that how they raised them to become raised the person to become intelligent today. And there's something known as natural selection. Natural selection is where genes that get passed down to offspring, those genes will help the offspring to thrive the most. Remember, this is different from evolution. Evolution deals from having basic life forms and how their offspring became more complex. Natural selection just deals with, it's a subtopic of evolution. It's one of the ways that animals evolve, if that makes sense. So on to levels of analysis. And what levels of analysis is it has differing views of why something happened. A lot of psychologists today agree with the biopsychosocial approach. This is the biological, psychological, and social approach. Biological meaning that it takes in, hormones and chemicals and what our body did, why we did something, or why something happened. Psychological takes in the mental state of why something happened, takes in why somebody did something. And the social approach would deal with more the culture that person did something in, what the person views as right and wrong. And in the modern world, there are 7 well-accepted psychological approaches. The first being behavioral, which is to learn from observable responses. Biological is how our bodies and genes trigger us. Cognitive deals with how we encode, process, store, and retrieve information. And evolutionary deals with how our genes promote survival. Pretty well intertwined with biological, but remember that they are still different. Humanistic deals with how we meet our needs for love and self-fulfillment and self-achievement. Psychodynamic, which we've talked about earlier, dealt with the unconscious drives and urges that us humans experience. Now, the social cultural is where how different cultures think differently. Like, someone that's American would see a situation differently than someone from, let's say, China, who is known as a collectivist society. So here's a couple terms that you will need to know, which is psychometrics. Psychometrics is a measurement of abilities and traits that a human has. And psychiatry is the medical treatments for mental disorders. Remember that there is a difference between psychiatrists and psychologists. Psychiatrists give prescribe medication to the patients. Psychologists do not. Alright, so for Module 3, it was quite self-explanatory. It dealt with more of the careers that you would have in psychology, which was about like social psychologists, developmental psychologists. And to be quite frank, most of the definitions of these psychologists are not going to be on the test. Alright, so that is it. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, if you want to see more, please drop a like,